Paul Rusesabagina, the man who was portrayed in the Oscar-nominated movie Hotel Rwanda, has been found guilty of terrorism-related charges after a month-long case that drew international condemnation. Rusesabagina was once praised for sheltering more than 1,200 people in the hotel he managed during Rwanda's 1994 genocide. Now, in recent years, he gradually became one of the most high-profile critics of Rwanda's longtime leader, Paul Kagame. Calling out the president for repressive rule, Kagame in turn accused Rusesabagina of profiting from invented stories about his heroism and of financing armed rebel groups to overthrow his government. He was tried on 9 charges, including forming an illegal armed group, kidnapping, arson, and murder.
The court finds that they should be found guilty for being part of this terror group, MRCD FLN. They attacked people in their homes, they attacked people in their cars, or even on the road traveling.
Now, bandits have released 10 more students kidnapped 2 months ago from a Baptist school in Nigeria. The school says 21 students remained captive last month. Bandits released 15 students after the second group of 28 was set free in July. This was after the first group of 28 students was released just 2 days after the raid. About 150 students went missing after armed men in July raided the school in Nigeria's Kaduna state. This is the 10th mass school kidnapping in the country since December last year. Now we turn our eyes to security in Africa. How are leaders contributing to their country's security challenges, and why does it seem like there is a lack of political will to create stability in Africa? Security expert David Africa joins us now to unpack this further. David, good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. I ask the question, what are the causes that lead to political opposition evolving into armed action?
Hi, good evening. Well, I think in the first instance we must accept that the causes are multiple and they are complex, and many of these causes have been there for the long duration on the continent, or particular countries on the continent. It's easy for us to say that, for example, it is due to poor leadership, by a president in country X, or an intolerance for opposition, all of which might be true. But the problem is that the legacy of colonialism remains very strong on the continent, because a number of things have happened, in the colonial period that continues to bedevil our societies and our politics. The one obviously is the destruction of the systems of managing societal conflict that existed, prior to their destruction by colonialism. And the other thing is that colonialism, when it formally left the continent in the 60s, didn't really leave. So what we find is that you have in many countries an elite that has been established to function at the behest of foreign powers, and through which foreign powers continue to exert significant influence, on the way in which politics is conducted in many countries on the continent. Yeah. Similarly, they influence opposition parties. So it doesn't mean that there's no legitimacy to the cries of opposition parties, for example. Yeah. But once you have a foreign dynamic entering a domestic political dispute, it complicates the matter, and it reduces the possibility of whatever disagreements there are being resolved peacefully.
To what extent, though, are the mechanism of repression to deal with dissent contributing to that trajectory?
Significantly, Tabo. I mean, the thing is that there are many countries on the continent where the project to democratize, and by democratize I mean in its authentic African form. I mean, there was a big project, obviously, in the colonial period, the anti-colonial movement. Then in the immediate period after colonialism, a big ideological and intellectual movement to democratize countries, and to develop, free expression and so on. We saw it even with South Africa's emergence into the democratic space, the project by President Mbeki, for example, and others on the continent, to drive a democratic project. So there's been these efforts. But in many countries, it has either failed or it has significant setbacks, so that the democratic space has been reduced in many countries. Yeah. In many countries, the governing elite is an elite that is disconnected from the reality of people. We ourselves, whilst we are a free country, a democratic country, we have similarly issues of an elite that seems not to have an appreciation of the life of ordinary people. Yeah. And so that repression, which is essentially anti-democratic, plays no small role in the growth of dissent in many countries, and sometimes the turn to violent forms of political expression.
Yeah. Talking about South Africa, there's a growing concern that individuals who feel excluded from the clientelist networks of the politically connected grow more and more despondent, and that, to an extent, leads to things like we saw the unrest, and that, would eventually lead to armed action against the ruling elite.
Yes, Tabo. Look, without justifying, the use of violence, because in South Africa we have many opportunities. We will be going to vote in a few weeks in a democratic election that we all expect to be free and fair. So there are means of expressing oneself, obviously. However, it is quite clear, to any sensible person, it must be clear by now that the project on which we embarked in the 1990s, which was to transform both the politics and the economy of the country and to meaningfully improve the lives of our people, that project has either failed or it has come to a standstill. And ordinary people, who've obviously placed their faith election after election in the ANC largely, find themselves living lives that in a material sense remains the same to what it was 20 years ago. We all know that apartheid was worse than whatever we are experiencing now. But people didn't sacrifice in order to live a life that's a little bit better. People wanted dignified lives that was fundamentally different to life under apartheid. We've not been able to deliver that to people. So especially younger people who do not have the nostalgia of a liberation struggle, find other means of expressing themselves. And we cannot be surprised by what happened in July. We should not also be surprised if it happens again, because materially speaking, we've not done anything to prevent its reoccurrence. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on you can't just pin it down on leadership, but of course leaders hardly ever really govern on their own. There are, of course, staff and people that are around them that also contribute to the actions of the leaders. How much of that collective contributes towards the formation of insurgency?
Well, I think in the first instance, we are looking in a democratic society, or even a sort of semi-democracy. It's impossible for one person to rule on her or his own. And so these collectives of leaders that we have, in a sense, the concept of collective responsibility is very popular in South Africa. And I think there is a sense, if you take South Africa and many other countries on the continent, where there's been a collective leadership failure. That failure often crosses the governing opposition divide. If we just look northwards to the neighboring, to our neighbor Zimbabwe, quite clearly the ruling party has made a mess of things. The opposition, similarly, has, by a range of actions, contributed to the situation in Zimbabwe. So I think that there is a poverty of leadership. If one compares it to, if you look at the concept of the African Renaissance, when you had President Mbeki, Bouteflika, Obasanjo, and others, really, developing the concepts, the ideas of how to democratize the continent in our own way, not by imposing a sort of particular template of democracy on the continent, but at the core of it was really the people governing themselves. But that sort of dynamic is no longer there. That sort of intellectual effort to say, can we reimagine the continent in a way in which we can coexist as governing and opposition parties, in which people are free to express themselves, and so on. And it has to start as an idea. And the problem is that this collective leadership that you are talking about, a sort of failed collective leadership, has not done the work of thinking about this democratic future, and a future where people can live with dignity. Apart from, when we talk about democratic future, we're not just talking about voting every 5 years, because we have that in South Africa.
Right.
And to be fair, the ordinary person, in Khayelitsha or KwaMashu is not much better off because of that.
Yeah.
So the poverty of a leadership that can think themselves out of the sort of stalemate in which we find ourselves is one of the biggest problems that we face.
David Afrika, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Security expert there, David Afrika, outlining some of the mechanisms that leads to the formation of armed forces that emerge from political opposition.